Hello, everyone. Oh, really? Apparently, Trump is discovering, shocker, that ending the war in Ukraine is a lot harder than he thought. No. Really? No way! A centuries old conflict rooted in nationalism and oppression is difficult to end? No. Everybody remembers, because this went on all of last year and then some, that throughout his election campaign, Donald Trump repeatedly promised that he could end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, even before he took office. Day one. Well, maybe within the first week. This is what happens when you open your mouth and start talking about something you're not familiar with. Discarding the fact that Russian and Ukrainian history goes back centuries, well before the United States of America was even a gleam in anybody's eye. That this history is steep in betrayal, complete loss of trust, nationalism, invasions, discrimination. There's a very long list of issues that exist between Russia and Ukraine. So, this is what happens. Now, I don't know how important the issue of Ukraine is to the Republican voters. I understand that most of them have the America for Americans and America first attitude toward this. But even if it is not important to them as such, I would simply like for them to add it to the list of more broken promises. The egg prices didn't go down, guys. We are not prosperous. And he did not end the war in 24 hours. So just add that item to the grand scheme of things. Oh, and what have we here? Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu threatened Europe with nuclear weapons if it does anything unfriendly to Russia. Which, if you look at Russian rhetoric for the last 20, 25 years, it can literally be anything. Like Macron could sneeze in the presence of Putin, and that could be considered excuse enough to whack Paris with a nuclear warhead. So, this goes back to the terms of peace, quote unquote, that the US is trying so hard to shove down Ukraine's throat. You'll remember, right? They said, well, maybe if we give Russia the territory, a fifth of Ukraine, unclear what happens to people who live there, maybe then they will stop and do Ukraine a big favor of not trying to invade the whole country. Yeah, gee, thanks. And then maybe Europe can maintain its troops there so that Russia doesn't do anything wrong. Well, except here we have from Russia that if Europe does any such thing, that would be considered an act of aggression, not just any act of aggression, but an act of aggression that warrants the use of nuclear weapons. Since the annexation of Crimea, for the last 11 years, those of us who grew up in Ukraine are familiar with the situation there, are familiar with history, have been repeating, this will not end in Ukraine. This will spread. This will affect everybody. And yes, US, you too. And I mentioned this in the past. I actually had to look that up, double check, fact check myself. And I was correct. US demanding Alaska back has been discussed by the Russian parliament as recently as January of this year. So if you think you're not next, you're delusional. Because here we have now Russia emboldened by the support from the U.S. administration, shaking the nuclear fist at Europe. I hope you all are happy. I mean, those of us who predicted this are definitely not happy. We would love to be wrong, but we're not. And yes, we totally told you so. Let's talk about Crimea, because I think everybody needs a refresher on Crimea. So US is pushing hard for Ukraine to recognize the ownership of Crimea by Russia. Ukraine and EU so far are both refusing. Ukraine and Europe both stated unequivocally that they will not recognize any such thing. First of all, we have an issue of territorial integrity. And for those of you who are saying, well, but what about before Khrushchev handed it over to Ukraine? Okay, then we can go back even farther and talk about, but what about the time Russia has hacked it off from Turkey? Did you know that? And what about Crimean Tatars who live there too? Maybe it should belong to them. Incidentally, if Crimean Tatars said, okay, y'all, we want our own republic. We want the peninsula for ourselves. We want our own country. That would be a different conversation. But Russia invaded it. And we'll talk in a minute how we can address Trump's statement, well, why didn't you fight for it? So we'll get to that. Let's talk about Trump's claims that Crimea was taken without force. That is a lie. It was taken by armed Russian troops in unmarked uniforms. And the next article I want to show you, this one in Associated Press, talks in great detail about all things Crimea, starting with the invasion. Trump still can't understand why ceding territory to Russia is such a bad idea. To put it in a language you understand, you idiot, it's that if you give them an inch, they will take a yard. You give them a finger, they will take an arm. That is their thing. They've been doing it throughout their history. So here is the map, and this is important. Here's the map of Crimea. And where it is makes it extremely strategically important to Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and European Mediterranean, because it allows, through the Black Sea, access to the Mediterranean. That is huge. Russia seized Crimea when Ukraine was at its most vulnerable. It had just booted out the pro-Russian dictator Yanukovych, who unleashed armed troops, elite troops, against Ukrainian civilians who were killed during the protests. Ukraine was still establishing the temporary government, so Russia just strolled in and decided, let me have some of that. After annexation, Russia held a bogus referendum at gunpoint, pretending like people in Crimea actually wanted to be a part of Russia. They did not. Here's your complete guide on why Crimea is so very important and the timeline of its ownership. Talks about what role it plays in the war, including being basically turned into a military base, and how it factors into the peace effort. Well, it's basically being used as a bargaining chip, but it's unacceptable to Ukraine. So read up, educate yourself, lots of good information in there, more to come.